voting down the school budget.
Right.
Right. And if, is it a majority of the communities approve it, then the budget is approved and we would have to make up the difference.
Correct.
And which we would then make an adjustment at April town meeting.
Correct. So if the majority of the communities vote to adopt the budget, then we'll have an additional amount that we'll be responsible for in the spring.
And if a majority of the communities vote it down, then it's up to the school department to propose another budget.
I think so.
Which they've already done once.
I think this is their third budget.
Third.
This is the third. There was one done in sometime in May. There was a second one, and that was the one that we voted at the June town meeting. There was another one that was adopted after our June town meeting concluded. And because we didn't have a town meeting schedule, it was deemed that we approved their budget. But there were a number of other communities, and you may have read about this in the newspaper. A number of the other communities challenged the fact that there was a de facto approval, and it was proven that the communities were right, that in fact their budget was rejected by the requisite number of communities forcing this action before town meeting.
Well, I mean, what this really amounts to is that the increase they're asking for is to cover their loss in state aid, if I look at the two budgets. Right? In fact, they're not asking for quite as much if we look at the fact that we've had an increase in students. Right. I guess I want to think about this and would prefer making a decision next Monday night. But the board wants to make, if someone wants to make a motion.
I can go either way, Bob. If you want to wait, I can wait. Doesn't have
I would
to be
prefer to
tonight.
wait.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't have a
All
problem with that.
Greg? No problem? Okay, we got through the informational here. I'm sorry about skipping over that. Mr. Yule, you
So
want
we're going to leave out the vocational aspect of this?
Yeah, we'll treat that as a motion at our next meeting.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I move to, excuse me, recommend at town meeting, Article 2, amend FY 2010 operating budget for the library.
Second. Motion by Mr. Yule, second by Mr. Vino. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Unanimous. Again, make a note that Mr. O'Leary was not present. Okay. Next item, Town Administrator's Report. You're welcome to stay.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Mr. Belkonis.
Okay. Please refer to the yellow sheet in your packet. And what I've done is I've given some thought to the budget calendar for FY 2011. And specifically looking at key dates for approval of the next fiscal year operating budget, I would urge the board to consider actions associated with delaying the budget decisions until June. The reasons for that are obvious given the state of the economy. The state has deferred all of its budgetary decisions until very late in the fiscal year, which happens to be May and June. We also have some uncertainty in terms of our local revenues, specifically local receipts. I think having the additional 2 months would prove beneficial in terms of truing up our budget numbers. So what I've done is I've taken the opportunity to draft a schedule, ask you to take a look at it, consider it, think about it, but I think it is something that does require discussion by the board sooner than later.
Board members, this was discussed at the financial planning team meeting a week ago, and I think for the most part everybody was in support of it. I don't know if Abby has brought that to the attention of your entire committee yet.
We haven't had a meeting, but over the past several years, when we've effectively done the same thing, but in an official way, the finance committee has been supportive of it.
Comments from board members?
It's fine to me.
the school committee was in support of it. I shouldn't say the school committee, the representatives of the school committee were in support of it. Okay, next, Greg?
Next, the board had asked at the meeting 2 weeks ago for me to take a look at the 2011 budget. What I've done is given you some projections going forward for next fiscal year. I would ask you to take a look at that briefly. It's at the yellow sheet.
Which one are you looking at, the revenue plan at this point?
Yeah, it's the revenue plan with the gray column that runs right down the middle, which is fiscal year 2011. And I think it's important to kind of put out there as the first line in the sand that it's conservative revenue and fixed cost assumptions. We're very early in the 2011 budget cycle, but I think it's important for all of us to understand that the economy has substantially affected the town's operations. And you'll note that in terms of looking at the new growth revenues, we've estimated $50,000 for 2011. That's down from $150,000 that we've estimated for this year. And again, that's driven by new construction in town. We've also established that state aid at this point, we're looking at potentially upwards of a 10% cut for the new fiscal year. Remains to be seen what that amount will ultimately be. Additionally, we've made some revisions in our local receipts, and you'll see that there are, if you look at the category, you'll see that there are increases, gains in the motor vehicle excise tax, penalties and interest, fees, licenses and permits, and these gains are partially offset by a reduction in investment income. You'll see that the amount's gone down $40,000. But the good news is we do have some growth in our local receipts, and I think it's fair and conservative at this point to put forth a number that I think is manageable and can be applied to the 2011 budget. So at this point, you'll note that on the reverse sheet, we have made an assumption on employee benefits. And the employee benefits across the board are up about 9%. And it's driven by the items that you see here, such as county retirement, workers' compensation, health insurance, and the town's Medicare assessment. The remaining employee benefits are relatively stable and fixed. There are a number of things in this budget assumption that remain to be seen as to whether they will plan out. For example, you'll note that the regional school assessment that we just spent considerable time talking about, what we've done, we budgeted a higher number. And we've pretty much taken the same approach throughout. The bottom line in all of this is that we have a fairly a bad situation for fiscal year 2011. Let's move along. The board had asked me.
Just a comment, Greg.
Yep.
If we look at the bottom of the second page, we have what we're anticipating is available for 2011 for school and town after we've subtracted out our fixed cost. We don't have a figure for 2010 in here. So
I don't know why that's not there, Bob.
could we get that put in when next time around? I'm sure it's available.
Let's talk about 2010. Selectman O'Leary at the last meeting had asked me to put together a list of budget exposures and contingencies. I think we were all looking at a fairly large hit in state aid. Fortunately, the state aid accounts were spared the governor's budget reductions on Friday, although there are some reductions in special ed, additional reductions in regional school transportation, and then finally an additional reduction in the Quinn bill reimbursement that cities and towns are receiving. I have no way of knowing exactly what those dollars are, but what you can see is that I've assumed, if you look at the unfunded exposures, I've assumed an amount here consistent with the cuts that were made last January by the governor, his 9C cuts. And I'm comfortable in saying that any of the cuts that we'll be translating for this year will be within that dollar amount, certainly not in excess of that dollar amount. Additionally, you'll see that we've identified a number of other unfunded exposures. Some we've talked about this evening, such as the vocational school assessment. We've talked about youth services. We've talked about the library. Additionally, we have unanticipated municipal retirements. I've estimated a cost of about $60,000. It'll be an item that we'll need to address at April town meeting. One senior level employee is leaving. We typically include this money in the retirements appropriation. We didn't foresee it. We didn't see it coming, so we'll have to look at refunding it going forward.
And just to make a note, this is not the superintendent's
No.
retirement. That was included in this year's school budget.
And I've also identified a funding gap in special education, which was put forward by the school administration. And whether this amount materializes remains to be seen, but we've set an amount of money here just in case. So the total budget exposures that we have is just under $500,000. We've worked on a plan to get to that number, and obviously this budget plan will need to be revised depending upon town meeting next week. I think a lot of questions will be answered and will help us reach some finality. But we do have some flexibility with the raise and appropriate. I specifically mentioned the meals tax, the cell tower. We also, I think I had presented to you, we have some flexibility in our local receipts. And we have identified a surplus in our county retirement article of $60,000, which we'll use to fund our retirements. The bottom line in all of this is that we still do have an amount that's unfunded, $171,000. We'll work on that in terms of the solution. I would ask you to turn over to the back page because there's some things that we've shown here. We've identified a number of other exposures that we've got covered for costs. And I think the one item I do want to point out here is that under number 7, we will be going into Springtown meeting with our balance of free cash of $250,000. So none of the budget adjustments that I'm suggesting will draw down on the town's reserves. They'll not utilize free cash, which is a one-time revenue. So that's an amount of money that I'm hoping we can apply toward expenditures in the spring, whether they're budget supplements or whether they're items that are necessary to cure the snow deficit. Hopefully we won't have a very bad year. And we've identified a number of other exposures here that we've tied up our costs on. And then finally, I think I talked a bit earlier about local receipts, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a detail in terms of the increase in local receipts that I had suggested of $165,800. And you'll see that the FY09 actuals, which were the June 30th numbers for motor vehicle excise, penalties and interest, fees, department revenues, licenses and permits, investment earnings, and the health insurance trust. And you'll see what we went into our budget with and what our budget was based on back in June. And what we would do is we could revise these upwards if there are additional state aid cuts that we would have, but we need to kind of do this in conjunction with setting the tax rate. So the long and the short of all of this is that I think we're in fair shape for the setting our tax rate. I think that we've identified what our exposures are and we're working toward a plan. We're slightly out at this point, but the reason why we're slightly off is some of the identified exposures may not even materialize. This is the 2010 budget plan that you asked me for. Are there any questions?
I think that, I'm going to comment to say that, considering the economy and the situation that all the communities in the country and in the state are facing, I feel comfortable with the management of our reserves and cash, and the way we've been managing the budget leaves us in what I would call reasonable shape going into